Welcome everybody. So this is the first out of a series of 4 videos that we'll be making on the anatomy of the female reproductive system. And this one's going to cover the basic anatomical relations of the internal and external reproductive organs. So we're going to start with something really basic, but I think very important to establish up front. Say you have a person and they're facing that way. So this side's the front and those are the 3 organs of the pelvis. Now, I've come across an alarmingly large number of students, mostly men, who don't seem to know what order they come in. So just for the record, from front to back, we've got the bladder, then uterus, and then rectum. And the passages that connect them to the outside are the urethra, vagina, and anus in that order. I think part of what confuses some people is that if you examine the external genitalia, you will find that both the urethra and the vagina are enclosed within a double fold of skin called the labia, whilst the anus stands by itself. So some people think that there's only 2 openings, there's actually 3. And lastly, the perineum is just the space between the anus and the genitals, in both men and women. There's lots of colloquial names for this part of the body. I'll leave it up to you to find out what those are. So to summarize, here's a couple more diagrams to illustrate the same idea. This first one, this is similar to what you might see in the anatomy lab if you have a prosected specimen that's been cut sagittally. You will find that indeed you've got the bladder in the front, uterus in the middle, and rectum at the back, connected by the urethra, vagina, and anus, and that both the urethral and vaginal openings are enclosed within the labia. Now, if you look at this diagram of the external genitalia, once again, it goes urethra at the front, vagina in the middle, anus at the back, and both the urethra and vagina are enclosed within the labia. And here's just some footage from a diagnostic laparoscopy. That whitish organ at the back is the colon or the rectum, and you've got the uterus in the middle and the bladder in the front. You can see that little round thing there is just the catheter balloon sitting in the bladder. Now, turns out the diagram I showed you earlier is a bit of an oversimplification. In real life, it looks more like this. There's no space in front of the bladder, not much space behind the rectum, and the pelvic floor is slanted downwards and backwards. So this creates 2 pouches for us, one between the bladder and the uterus, so it's called the vesicouterine, remembering vesico means bladder, and one between the rectum and the uterus called the rectouterine. And because the pelvic floor is slanted backwards like this, the rectouterine pouch is further down, which means that any fluid, like blood, is going to collect there. So they will always check the rectouterine pouch during surgery to make sure there's no blood. And for those of you wondering what the anatomy looks like analogously in men, I will show you. So obviously there's no vagina or uterus, and the gonads, so the testes in men, sit down in the scrotum, which is actually the embryological equivalent of the labia. So they actually come all the way down like that into the scrotum. Do you want to see that animation again? They come all the way down like that. Alright, so moving on to the internal organs now. I'm sure you've seen a diagram like this many times before, ever since high school, so I won't spend any time going over the individual parts because you know that stuff already. But what I will do is clarify a couple of the misconceptions I see floating around. So the first one being that a lot of these diagrams make it look like the fallopian tubes are attached to the ovaries. They are not actually attached to the ovaries, in fact. The ovaries are sort of held in place by a couple of ligaments, and the fallopian tubes just sort of freely float around them. So in that regard, I actually like this diagram a little better. And what happens during ovulation is a sort of pimple forms on the ovary, which ruptures to release the egg. And the fallopian tubes have these finger-like projections on the end called fimbriae, which at some point will just mop up the egg as they sort of brush past. And microscopically, the fimbriae have little cilia, which then direct the egg into the lumen of the tube. And the other thing I want to cover is that a lot of people don't seem to know what exactly the cervix is. The cervix is just the bottom part of the uterus which protrudes out into the vaginal canal. So if you have a look on the previous diagram, it's this part here. So when you do a speculum exam and you part the vaginal canal, most people know that you see this sort of rounded structure in there, and that's the cervix, but really what you're looking at is just this rounded apex of the uterus. And lastly, you note on this diagram that there is a bit of an angle between the vaginal canal and the cervix, and another angle between the cervix and the body of the uterus. Those are called the version and the flexion, respectively. And the way I remember that, version starts with a V, so it's closer to the vagina, whereas the flexion starts with F, so it's closer to the fundus of the uterus. and most women are anteverted and anteflexed. So here's your summary slide. I hope that's been a useful introduction, and keep an eye out for our next video, which will cover the ligaments.